Philadelphia, Mississippi, -1964. A quiet southern town, rooted in tradition, suddenly finds itself under a national spotlight it never asked for. Across the Deep South, decades of racial segregation are being challenged head-on. And in this place, resistance is not subtle. Before the summer is over, 3 young civil rights workers will vanish without a trace, pulling the eyes of the entire world toward a community hiding a deadly secret. This is the story of what happened when change came to Mississippi, and how far some were willing to go to stop it. Freedom Summer. By the summer of 1964, Mississippi stood at a breaking point. For Black Mississippians, the air carried cautious hope, the promise of voting rights and equal citizenship. For many white residents, it brought fear, anger, and open defiance. President Lyndon Johnson was preparing to sign the Civil Rights Act. Meanwhile, civil rights organizations planned a bold campaign known as Freedom Summer, sending hundreds of young volunteers from northern states into Mississippi to help. Black citizens registered to vote. To supporters, it was justice long overdue. To opponents, it was an invasion. Locals quickly gave it a name, the Summer Invasion. And as the volunteers prepared to arrive, the Ku Klux Klan, often called the Invisible Empire, began mobilizing in the shadows. The men who wouldn't back down 6 months before Freedom Summer officially began. A 24-year-old social worker from New York named Michael Schwerner arrived in Mississippi. Schwerner, outspoken and idealistic, set up operations in Meridian alongside his wife Rita. He was soon joined by James Chaney, a 21-year-old Black Mississippian who understood the local dangers better than anyone. Later came Andrew Goodman, a 20-year-old volunteer from Queens, fresh out of training in Ohio. 3 young men from completely different backgrounds united by a single belief that equality was worth the risk. But to local Klansmen, Schwerner stood out immediately. His beard earned him a nickname whispered with hatred, Goatee, the Devil, and he was marked. A warning in flames, Schwerner began holding meetings at Mount Zion Methodist Church, a black church in the rural community of Longdale. That decision sealed the church's fate. One night, Klansmen descended on the area. Church members were beaten. Women were attacked. And before dawn, Mount Zion was burned to the ground. Local authorities did nothing. The FBI quietly opened a file aware that violence was escalating and that worse was coming. June 21st, 1964. 5 days after the church burning, Schwerner, Chaney, and Goodman drove from Meridian to Longdale to speak with church members. They planned to return that same afternoon. They never did. On their way back, the trio was stopped outside Philadelphia, Mississippi, by Deputy Sheriff Cecil Price. Chaney was arrested for speeding. Schwerner and Goodman were detained without explanation. They were held in jail for hours past the time Schwerner was supposed to check in with civil rights organizers. At 10:30 p.m., they were released. That was the last confirmed sighting of all 3 men alive. Vanished by morning, panic set in. The FBI was notified. Local officials dismissed the disappearance as a hoax, claiming the men had staged it for publicity. But agents feared something far worse. 2 days later, a burned-out station wagon was discovered in a swamp near Philadelphia. It was the men's vehicle. Nearby, investigators found a wristwatch and car keys. Hope faded. Mississippi burns. As the search intensified, Mississippi erupted. Churches were torched. Homes were firebombed. Black families were terrorized nightly. The FBI flooded the state, eventually deploying nearly 300 agents. Federal pressure mounted. Informants began to crack. One anonymous source, known only as Mr. X, finally broke the case open. He told agents exactly where the bodies were buried. Old Jolly Farm on August 4, 1964. FBI agents arrived at an earthen dam under construction on Old Jolly Farm, owned by a powerful local landowner. Heavy machinery began digging. 14 feet down, the smell told them everything. First came Michael Schwerner, then Andrew Goodman, then James Chaney. All three had been executed. Evidence showed Goodman had struggled clay embedded in his hand, suggesting he may have still been alive when buried. The conspiracy exposed the murders were not random. They were planned. Deputy Cecil Price had alerted local Klansmen while the men sat in jail. When they were released, they were followed, stopped again, abducted, and executed on a dark country road. Their bodies were buried beneath a dam. Their car was burned. Silence was expected. Instead, the nation erupted. Justice, but only barely because murder charges fell under state jurisdiction. Mississippi refused to prosecute. The federal government charged 19 men not with murder, but with civil rights violations. In 1967, after years of delays, 8 men were convicted. The harshest sentence, 10 years. No one was ever tried by the state for murder. A legacy that couldn't be buried. The killings of Schwerner, Goodman, and Chaney changed America. They shattered the illusion that violence was exaggerated. They exposed the deep collaboration between law enforcement and white supremacist groups. And they forced the nation to confront the cost of equality. Mount Zion Church was rebuilt. It now stands as a memorial, not just to 3 men, but to a moment when the truth refused to stay buried.